From heartbreak to strategy, Elena Vance outsmarts her cheating billionaire husband, uses legal power and alliances to reclaim her life, protect her unborn child, and seize control of his company, teaching us that self-respect, intelligence, and patience are more powerful than wealth or manipulation. So if you were moved, please give 1 like and 1 share to motivate more thrilling tales. Thanks for watching.
Damian Blackwood moved through life like he owned the very air, his massive real estate empire slicing into the Manhattan skyline, his private islands scattered across the globe like jewels. Bankers lowered their voices when his name hit the boardroom table. Elena, his wife, carried his child and a name that commanded respect, though she was little more than a quiet shadow in his world. He assumed she would always forgive his transgressions because she possessed a grace he found easy to exploit while he vacationed in Paris. Sleeping beside another woman and calling it a business trip, Elena was not home crying. She was building a case when he finally returned. Expecting a diamond bracelet to smooth over his absence, he found himself walking into a war he had already lost. This is not just a story about infidelity. It is a story about a woman who spent years being underestimated, only to sharpen that neglect into a lethal weapon. Elena never resorted to screaming, breaking dishes, or begging for his attention. She simply watched, learned, and waited. She protected her unborn child with a ferocity that eclipsed her own bruised pride. By the time Damian realized his wife was not the fragile, naive creature he described to his inner circle, the trap had already sprung. She had secured her finances, retained a shark of a lawyer, befriended his greatest rival, and begun the precise methodical process of taking back her life and her name. The evening before Damian took off for his getaway in Paris, he humiliated Elena in front of 200 of their closest acquaintances at the Blackwood Foundation Gala. The ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers, expensive champagne towers, and a pack of photographers desperate for a perfect, glossy picture of the high-powered billionaire and his glowing, pregnant wife. Elena wore a soft, pale blue gown that clung to the gentle curve of her stomach. She felt nervous, exhausted, and strangely, stubbornly hopeful. Damian had sworn he would stay by her side that night. He broke that vow before the salad course was even served. Serafina Dubois swept in late, wearing a scarlet dress designed specifically to turn every head in that room. Damian noticed her arrival instantly, and Elena, standing right beside him, watched him watch her. She tried to tell herself she was just being paranoid, a side effect of the pregnancy. Then, Damian abandoned her near the donors to cross the floor and greet Serafina with a kiss that lingered far too close to her mouth. A photographer snapped the moment. Elena stepped forward, attempting to intervene before the image became a public story. Damian turned back, flashed a cold, soft laugh, and said, "Darling, do not hover. You look exhausted. Go sit down before people start worrying." Those words sounded polite enough that a stranger might mistake them for husbandly concern. But everyone within earshot heard the sharp sting of dismissal. A few women in the crowd glanced at Elena with pity. A man near them quickly looked away. Serafina smirked behind her champagne flute. Elena stood paralyzed, one hand resting on her belly, feeling the burning heat rise into her face, while camera flashes went off all around her. Damian offered Serafina his arm and guided her toward the private donor table, leaving his pregnant wife alone beneath a chandelier, bright enough to expose every crack in her composure. That was the exact moment Elena stopped pleading. On the private flight home 2 weeks later, Damian was not thinking about that gala. His mind was still firmly planted in Paris. The jet sliced through a violent storm over New York, its engines straining against the heavy rain. As he loosened his $800 silk tie, he felt tired, but it was the satisfied exhaustion of a man who believed he had successfully conquered 2 cities in 1 week. The deal had closed, the champagne had flowed, and Serafina Dubois had been waiting in high-thread count sheets at Le Bristol. She made him feel brilliant, dangerous, and young again. Elena, in his mind, had become something else entirely, safe, polished, predictable. He told himself Elena would understand, because she always had. She was 5 months pregnant, yes, and he had abandoned her for 2 weeks. But he had sent flowers, called twice, and bought a diamond bracelet from an exclusive jeweler near Place Vendôme. That was how Damien managed his guilt. He converted it into cold, hard currency. A gift was always easier than a genuine apology. A receipt was far cleaner than a conversation about remorse. He never gave a second thought to the nights Elena likely spent alone, hand on her belly, listening to the rain and remembering how he had made her small. The private elevator doors slid open to reveal the $80 million penthouse. Usually, the housekeeper would appear before the doors were even fully open. Usually, Elena waited in the grand salon with a book on her lap and that gentle, patient smile he had once admired and eventually took entirely for granted. Tonight, nobody came. The apartment felt suffocatingly still. The marble floors reflected the city lights in long, cold lines. Rain tapped incessantly against the massive windows. Damien stepped inside, feeling irritated before he even felt worried. He hated any kind of disorder. To him, silence felt like a direct act of disobedience. "Elena," he called out. His voice traveled through the high-ceilinged rooms designed to impress strangers but comfort absolutely no one. He finally found her in his private study, the one room in the apartment she almost never entered unless he specifically asked. It was a dark, expensive sanctuary filled with mahogany shelves, leather club chairs, and framed newspaper covers that celebrated his various business victories. She was sitting directly behind his desk. That stopped him in his tracks. The desk cost $300,000, custom-made in Milan. Damien loved that desk because it made everyone sitting across from him feel small. Tonight, Elena owned it. She wore a simple cream cashmere dress that hugged the curve of her pregnancy without trying to hide it. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, tight chignon, and her face appeared pale, almost tired. But her eyes were not tired. They were clear, calm, and colder than the glass skyline looming behind her. For the first time in months, Damien actually noticed the undeniable shape of her belly. His child was no longer just a convenient idea he could mention at board dinners. The baby was real, Elena was real, and somehow that stark reality made the entire room feel much smaller, much tighter. "You are back," she said. There was no warmth in her voice, and certainly no anger. It was just a cold statement of fact. Damien slipped into his usual rehearsed performance, the one that had worked on jaded investors, aggressive journalists, and occasionally his wife. "It was a brutal trip," he said, pulling off his expensive coat. "The French are impossible." Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out the velvet box, and placed it on the desk. "I saw this in Paris and thought of you." The bracelet inside was worth $150,000. An apology, a bribe, and a leash, all disguised as love. Elena stared at the box but did not move to touch it. That bothered him more than if she had screamed at him. She had always been gracious. Even when she was deeply hurt, she had thanked people properly. "I am glad you enjoyed Paris." "Damien," she said. Her voice was so perfectly, even it sounded completely rehearsed. "You must have been very comfortable at Le Bristol." Damien's fingers tightened around his coat. He had told her he was staying at the Four Seasons. Le Bristol was where he kept the private suite that no one in his official, polished life was ever supposed to know about. For half a second, he considered telling the truth, or at least a convincing lie. Then his arrogant instinct took over. "Elena, I have no idea what you mean." She raised one hand, not dramatically, just enough to cut him off. "Do not lie to me tonight. I am too tired for it." He stared at her, stunned. Something about that sentence unsettled him to his core. It was not the accusation, but the profound exhaustion beneath it. She had not said it like a wife trying to catch him in a mistake. She had said it like someone who had already buried the marriage and was only there to close the file. 3 months earlier, Elena had found the first message. Damien had fallen asleep in their bedroom with his phone on the nightstand, face up, arrogant even in his carelessness. The screen lit up at 2:17 in the morning. "Last night was divine, my love." Elena had stared at the words until they blurred. She was 12 weeks pregnant then, still sick every morning, still hiding crackers in her bedside drawer, still desperately trying to convince herself that Damien was simply buried in work. She did not wake him. She did not throw the phone across the room. She went into the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the cold tile until the sun rose. that morning. Damien kissed her forehead while checking his emails over her shoulder. She smelled another woman's expensive perfume on his shirt and almost broke down right there. But the baby fluttering inside her, too small to kick yet, too precious to risk, changed the shape of her grief. Elena understood something in that bathroom. If she confronted Damien too soon, he would bury her under lawyers, money, and practiced charm. He would call her emotional. He would say the pregnancy had made her paranoid. He would win before she had any evidence. So she swallowed the scream, washed her face, and began to plan. She started small. She asked innocent questions about taxes, trusts, company holdings, and household accounts. Damien laughed at her at first. My little CFO, he called her at dinner, amused by what he believed was just nesting behavior. Elena smiled back, nodded, and wrote everything down later that night. She learned which accounts were joint, which assets were considered marital property, which homes were protected, and which loopholes existed in the strict prenup he had made her sign while his lawyer watched like a priest at a sacrifice. The more she learned, the less she cried. Knowledge did not heal the wound, but it gave her somewhere to put the pain. The first time she called Marcus Thorne, her hands shook so badly she almost hung up before his assistant answered. Marcus listened for 20 minutes without interrupting a single time. Then he asked one question. Are you safe? It was the first time anyone had asked her that instead of asking whether she was sure about her suspicions. Elena looked across the nursery she had been decorating entirely alone. At the tiny white crib Damien had approved through a decorator, and said, not yet. Marcus did not promise quick revenge. He promised preparation. That was exactly what she needed to survive. Over the next few weeks, Elena became two different women. In public, she remained Damien's elegant, pregnant wife, smiling beside him at charity events and touching his arm when the photographers called their names. In private, she sent classified documents to Marcus, memorized private account numbers, met a discreet investigator in small cafes where no one from Damien's high-stakes world would ever look twice, and learned exactly how badly her husband had underestimated her intelligence. She also learned that his affair with Serafina was not his only secret. Hidden inside the complex financial records were transfers that simply did not belong in any marriage, any company, or any clean conscience. Back in the silent study, the weight of the air felt suffocating. Damien stood there, firmly convinced that this was merely a minor misunderstanding about a trip to Paris. He genuinely believed that one cold denial, a shallow apology, and an expensive peace offering would reset their world to his design. Elena stood up slowly, her hand steadying her frame against the heavy mahogany desk, while her other hand rested protectively over her stomach. Damien, your capacity for lying is truly poor, she said softly. You have simply grown accustomed to surrounding yourself with people who are paid to ignore the truth. I was one of them for far too long. I was bought with status, comfort, and the false security of being the chosen one. Tonight, that entire arrangement finally comes to an end. Are you actually hearing yourself speak right now? Damien snapped, his voice tight with irritation. You are pregnant, Elena. You are clearly emotional. Sit down immediately before you do something that hurts yourself. It was exactly the patronizing tone she had expected, smooth and polite on the surface, but deeply cruel underneath. She pushed a thick, heavy blue folder across the polished desk. It landed right beside the velvet box with a dull, final thud. I am making perfect sense. Damien, these are divorce papers. Marcus Thorne filed them at 9 this morning. Your lawyers were served 5 minutes later. I imagine Arthur has been trying to reach you with frantic messages ever since. Damien stared at the folder as if it were a foreign object that had appeared by some dark magic. He opened it, his fingers moving stiffly. His expression shifted from irritation to shock as he scanned the pages. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Elena Vance Blackwood, petitioner, versus Damien Orrs Blackwood, respondent. He let out a single, harsh laugh that held absolutely no humor. This is total absurdity, he spat. You are carrying my son, my heir. Elena flinched, not because his anger frightened her, but because, even now, he refused to use the word child. He could not say baby. He could not grasp the idea of love without the cold, hard reality of ownership. "It is a girl," Elena said, her voice quiet but piercing. Damien blinked, momentarily thrown. "What? Our baby is a girl," she continued. "I found out last week while you were in Paris. For one fleeting second." Something resembling genuine embarrassment flickered across his face. Then, the familiar wall of pride returned, wounded and dangerous. "You should have told me," he insisted. "I tried," Elena replied. "I called you right after the appointment." A woman answered the phone, laughed at me, and hung up. Damien looked away, his jaw working. That silence told her more than any verbal confession ever could have. She had expected it, yet it still hurt. That was the cruelest part of betrayal. Even with cold, hard proof, the pain remained. "You signed a prenup," Damien said, his voice regaining its practiced composure. "You will receive the house allowance, the 10 million, and whatever vanity charity title keeps you busy enough. Then you will calm down." Elena stepped around the desk, maintaining a firm distance. "I signed a prenup that your lawyer drafted poorly because you assumed I would never actually use the one specific clause designed to protect me. Article 7, Section 4, Damien's jaw tightened visibly. "Infidelity," she said clearly. "Proven marital misconduct voids all your payout limits and forces full equitable distribution." Arthur insisted on that clause himself because he truly thought it would protect your assets from a disaster like this. "You cannot prove anything," Damien stated, his voice hard. Elena almost offered a sad smile. 3 months ago, that sentence would have sent her into a spiral of fear. Tonight, it just sounded like the desperate, final defense of a man who had never once been forced to defend himself. "I have hotel records, flight manifests, staff statements, photographs, card charges, and copies of your messages," she listed calmly. "I have enough evidence for court. Enough for the board of directors, and enough for every newspaper that has ever printed your face. I do not want a public war, Damien, but I am no longer afraid of one." His charm evaporated so quickly it was almost fascinating. "You have absolutely nothing without me," he hissed. "I own this apartment. I own the cars, the staff, the bank accounts. I own the life you enjoy." Elena looked around the study, at the awards, the leather chairs, and the expansive city skyline he treated like an extension of his own ego. "That is what you never understood," she said. "I did not actually enjoy this life. I merely survived inside it. And I will not raise my daughter in a house where her mother is humiliated in silence while her father calls that behavior loyalty." "Where do you think you are going?" Damien demanded as she walked toward the door. "To my new home. You will never find it," he said, his voice dropping into something menacing. "I will have you declared mentally unstable. I will tell the court that you vanished with my child. I will take the baby before she is even born." Elena stopped, her hand resting on the cold brass handle. That specific threat had kept her awake for weeks on end. It still sent a cold shiver down her spine, but she turned back to face him, and her voice did not shake. "You can certainly try," she said, for the first time that night. Damien saw something in her eyes he did not recognize. It was not rage. It was not grief. It was absolute resolve. "You are not the only one with secrets," she said. "Mine are much bigger than a cheap affair in Paris. Good night, Damien." She walked out, leaving him standing in the study with the unopened bracelet and the folder that marked the beginning of his downfall. He heard her heels clicking against the marble floor, then the elevator bell, and then total silence. The quiet returned, but this time it did not feel like obedience. It felt like a final judgment. For 30 long seconds, Damien stood completely still. Then his phone began buzzing aggressively on the desk. He had left it on silent during his flight back. There were 14 missed calls from Arthur Kensington, 8 from Serafina, a dozen frantic text messages. "Call me immediately." Code red. "Where are you?" She filed. Then came the message that made his stomach turn over. "Damien, she is officially invoking Article 7. Call me now." He ignored the messages from Serafina and dialed Arthur. The lawyer answered before the first ring finished. "Damien, thank God. Tell me you have not spoken to her alone," he said. "Fix this immediately," Damien snapped, ignoring the lawyer's plea. Arthur exhaled heavily on the other end. I have been trying to reach you for 10 hours. Damien, this is not a simple tantrum. This is a coordinated legal strike. She filed for divorce, yes, but she also filed emergency motions for asset preservation, temporary support, and custody protections before the baby is even born. Custody protections, Damien said, his voice rising. The child is not even here yet. Exactly, Arthur replied. Marcus Thorne is arguing anticipatory harm based on public humiliation, infidelity, emotional distress, and your clear pattern of control. Damien's face hardened. Marcus Thorne. She cannot afford him, he muttered. She can certainly afford him now, Arthur said. She requested access to $5 million from the marital funds to cover legal fees, and the judge granted a temporary allowance by noon today. Damien gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. That is my money. It is marital money, Arthur said very carefully. Damien hated when Arthur used that careful tone. It always meant bad news was being gift-wrapped for delivery. And that is not even the real problem. The real problem is the prenup. She is not challenging it at all. She is enforcing it. Article 7 opens the entire marital estate if the misconduct is proven by clear evidence. There is no clear evidence, Damien said. Though even he could hear the distinct weakness in his own voice, Arthur did not offer any comfort. Marcus attached a preliminary dossier, he continued. We have hotel records from La Bristol, photographs of you and Serafina entering the suite together, restaurant receipts, a jewelry invoice from Paris that does not match the bracelet you gave Elena, messages from your company phone, staff affidavits from the hotel, and 2 former employees from here. Damien sat down slowly. Former employees. Melissa resigned this morning, Arthur said. So did your driver. They are fully cooperating with Elena. The sheer scale of the betrayal infuriated Damien more than the evidence itself. He had paid those people well. He had foolishly assumed that loyalty was something you could buy with a steady salary. Arthur continued his report. Damien, she has been documenting this for months. This is clean. Too clean. She hired professional investigators. She worked with forensic accountants. She knew exactly where to look. What does she want? Damien asked, his voice low. Arthur hesitated for a moment. Just say it, Damien growled. 200 million in liquid assets, the Hamptons estate, the penthouse, full custody, and a 49% non-voting stake in Blackwood Industries for the child. Damien let out a laugh, but it sounded thin and jagged. She wants half my life, he said. More than half. Arthur corrected him quietly. She wants safety from you. Damien, there is a very real difference. Damien slammed his palm against the desk. Find her. Check with her mother. Check with Chloe. Track the cars. Freeze the bank cards. She is my wife. Damn it. You cannot freeze her accounts without a massive court fight, Arthur replied. And her old cards are already inactive. She transferred her personal funds yesterday. Her security team resigned. And the new team looks private, disciplined, and very expensive. Damien, she is really gone. Across town, Elena was not celebrating her victory. She was sitting on the edge of a bed in a quiet, secluded Hudson Valley estate, breathing through a wave of fear so intense it made her hands go numb. Chloe Jensen sat right beside her, holding a glass of water that Elena had not yet touched. You actually got out of there, Chloe whispered, still in disbelief. Elena nodded, but the tears finally broke loose. They were not loud, dramatic tears. They were not the kind Damien would have dismissed as hysterical. They were silent, exhausted tears from a woman who had carried far too much alone. I am so scared, she finally said. I know, Chloe answered. That was the part that no one ever saw in those glitzy stories about revenge. Real courage did not feel like power while you were actually living through it. It felt like nausea, shaking hands, and checking the front door locks twice every hour. Elena had not left Damien because she had suddenly stopped loving him. Some broken part of her still remembered the man who had danced with her in a library during their first winter together. The man who once said her laugh made the city feel less ugly. But that man had become a story he told when he needed forgiveness. She could not raise a daughter inside a hollow memory. Marcus Thorne called her after midnight. His voice was calm, but it held a sharp edge. He knows about Article 7, Marcus told her. He is furious. He will move very fast. Elena wiped her face with a tissue. What will he do first? He will try to paint you as unstable, Marcus replied. He will leak stories to the press. He may even try to force a psychiatric evaluation or file an emergency custody claim before the birth. Chloe closed her eyes, looking pained. Elena placed one firm hand on her belly. Then we move first, she said. Marcus paused on the line. You sound much steadier than before. I am not steady, Elena replied. I am just finished being passive. Serafina Dubois sat perfectly still in her suite at the Carlyle, the city lights of New York blurring into a tapestry of gold beyond the glass as she waited for Damien to reply. Her entire existence had been carefully constructed on the foundations of charm, beauty, and impeccable timing. Her father had once been a highly respected art dealer in Paris, a man of stature, until a mountain of debt and a very public scandal tore the family legacy apart. Serafina learned the rules early affection was a useful currency, but access was the real prize. Damien had promised her both. He spun a narrative of a cold, empty marriage, painting Elena as a fragile creature and the pregnancy as a mistake that had trapped him. Serafina swallowed every word, because believing him made her future seem infinitely brighter, even if she knew she was playing a dangerous game. She typed another message, her thumb hovering over the screen. Damien, darling, I am back in New York. I hope Elena is still unaware of us. We should celebrate our time in Paris properly. Send the car for me, S. She stared at the glowing screen, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for the 3 dancing dots that signaled a reply, but they never appeared. The silence was deafening, igniting a flash of white-hot anger before the cold. Hollow ache of fear settled in. Damien had promised her much more than secret hotel rooms. He had whispered of a new life waiting for them after the baby was born, a clean separation, a public partnership, and the Helios Gen division that would make them both untouchable. If he was suddenly silent, it meant something had gone terribly wrong. Damien was already staring at a message from an unknown number when Serafina's text chirped on his phone. You asked how I knew. It read, You left your phone out 3 months ago. I saw her message. I did not scream because screaming would have helped you. Not me. I called a lawyer. Everything after that. My questions about money, my sudden interest in your calendar, my quiet mornings, even my smiles, was strategy. You did not just cheat, Damien. You underestimated your wife. That was the mistake. Damien roared, his arm whipping back as he hurled the phone against the wall with all his might. The screen shattered into a spider web of glass, but the words stayed burned into his mind, cold and sharp as a razor. 3 days later, the air in Marcus Thorne's conference room was thick enough to choke on. Damien sat across from Marcus, flanked by Arthur Kensington and 2 associates who looked like they were counting the minutes until they could resign. The room offered a direct, mocking view of Blackwood Industries across the avenue. Damien knew it was deliberate, a psychological play. Marcus Thorne sat opposite him in a charcoal suit, his expression as controlled and unreadable as a stone wall. Beside him sat Rachel Ives, a sharp-eyed woman serving as co-counsel on the custody matter. Elena was absent. Damien hated that the most. She was making him fight her shadow, denying him the chance to see the panic he wanted to be there. Mr. Blackwood, Marcus began, his voice calm and steady. My client will not attend hostile settlement meetings while she is pregnant. We will speak on her behalf. Cut the performance, Damien snapped, leaning forward. Just name your price and let us get this over with. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply opened a manila folder. There is no price that makes this situation disappear. There are, however, terms that can prevent further escalation. Arthur leaned in, his voice urgent. Article 7 is not self-executing. We can contest the evidence you claim to have. Marcus nodded, entirely unbothered. Of course, you may contest anything you like. Then, he clicked a remote, and the wall-mounted screen flared to life, showing a photograph of Damien kissing Serafina outside La Bristol. Damien looked away, his jaw tight, but Marcus kept his gaze fixed on him. Exhibit A, he stated, Paris. Last Wednesday, 11:43 p.m. Exhibit B, he continued, sliding over an invoice charged to a corporate account and later reclassified as hospitality research. Exhibit C, Lake Como, 6 months ago. Exhibit D, the Blackwood Foundation Gala. where you abandoned your pregnant wife in front of donors and photographers to escort Ms. Dubois to a private table. Arthur's mouth tightened, his face paling. Marcus, that is not evidence of adultery, he argued. No, Marcus said, locking eyes with Damien. It is evidence of humiliation. Judges understand patterns. Mr. Kensington, so do juries. You had my wife followed, Damien hissed, his knuckles white against the mahogany table. Your wife had her husband investigated after discovering clear evidence of adultery and financial concealment, Rachel Ives replied, her voice cool and clinical. There is a profound difference. Damien glared at her, but Marcus continued without skipping a beat. The divorce terms are straightforward. $200 million in liquid assets within 30 days, transfer of the penthouse and Hampton's estate, a child trust holding 49% non-voting interest in Blackwood Industries, full legal and physical custody to Elena Vance, subject to supervised visitation. Damien stared, stunned. Vance. She is using her maiden name again. She began using it the moment she filed, Marcus said, watching Damien's composure fray. Damien's jaw worked as he fought for control. You people are truly insane if you think I will sign away my child. Rachel slid another document forward. Then you should read the psychological impact statement from Dr. Rebecca Mann, the prenatal therapist Elena has been seeing for 6 weeks. It documents emotional neglect, threats of control, and repeated public humiliation. Damien laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. So she found a therapist to call her a victim. No, Rachel corrected him sharply. She found a therapist because she was terrified of you. The sentence landed harder than Damien had expected, shaking his ego. Marcus watched him closely, sensing the shift in the room. This is not only about infidelity, Mr. Blackwood. It is about your conduct toward your wife, your unborn child, your employees, and your company. Damien's eyes narrowed into slits. My company is not part of this divorce. It became part of this divorce the moment your hidden transfers appeared in marital financial records, Marcus countered. Arthur went deathly still. Marcus placed a red-tabbed folder on the table, the Helios Gen patent. Damien did not move, but the color drained from his face entirely. Marcus noticed. Everyone noticed. The room went very quiet. My client found irregular payments routed through a Cayman entity, Marcus said, his voice rhythmic and precise. Those payments connect to a former engineer who worked for Justin Thorne's Clean Energy Division before the Helios Gen patent appeared under your company's name. Damien forced a thin, hollow smile. You are reaching, he said, though his voice wavered. Marcus did not blink. Justin Thorne disagrees. Damien looked up sharply, his confidence wavering. Justin Thorne was not just a competitor. He was the man Damien had beaten 2 years earlier in a fight that built Blackwood's future. Marcus leaned back. He is also my brother. Arthur closed his eyes, likely wishing the ceiling would collapse. This is blackmail, Damien declared, his voice rising. No, Marcus replied, his tone icy. Blackmail would be demanding money to hide a crime. This is a settlement offer in a divorce where evidence of financial fraud affects marital assets, corporate valuation, and parental fitness. Arthur rubbed his aching forehead. Marcus, give us a moment, he pleaded. Damien stood so fast, his chair screeched against the floorboards. I will fight this for 10 years. I will put Elena on every front page. I will show the court exactly what she is. Marcus' voice dropped, becoming a low, dangerous growl. Finish that sentence very carefully. Damien leaned over the table. She is manipulative, unstable, dangerous. Rachel closed her folder with a snap. Then we are done for today, she stated. Marcus stood, signaling the end of the meeting. You have 24 hours to accept the first offer. After that, my client assumes you are choosing litigation, and we will respond accordingly. Damien smiled with open, ugly contempt. Tell my wife she picked the wrong war. Marcus opened the door, holding it for them. I will tell her you still believe she is fighting alone, he said quietly. Damien walked out, his face flushed with fury. But beneath that anger, something else had begun. It wasn't exactly fear. Fear required admitting he was in danger. What Damien felt was the first terrifying crack in his absolute certainty. He did not sign the papers. Instead, he chose to attack. By sunrise the next morning, His PR team had delivered a story to Tara Reynolds, a gossip columnist who owed Damien favors and preferred destroying women over checking facts. The headline spread across every phone in New York: Blackwood marriage in crisis. Pregnant wife vanishes. Friends fear for her fragile state. The article painted Damien as a worried, devoted husband searching for his emotionally unstable wife. It mentioned Elena's pregnancy 6 times and her legal filing only once. The message was unmistakable. He was the concerned protector. She was the unwell patient. The article stung Elena more than she dared to admit. She sat at the breakfast table in the safe house, her hands trembling, while Chloe paced behind her, swearing under her breath. Fragile, volatile, isolated. The words were chosen with surgical precision. They made her sound like a woman who couldn't be trusted with her own body, let alone the life of a child. Elena set the tablet down and pressed both hands to her belly, trying to protect her baby. For one terrifying second, she imagined a judge reading that article and seeing not a mother, but a liability. Damien knew exactly how to twist the knife. Then the second leak came, and this one was even worse. A cropped photo from the foundation gala showed Elena standing alone, tears glistening in her eyes, while Damien appeared in the background, leaning close to Serafina. The caption labeled Elena as emotional and overwhelmed before her disappearance. It conveniently omitted Damien dismissing her. It left out the whispers, the cruel laughter, and Serafina's smug smile. It turned Elena's public humiliation into proof of her instability. Chloe wanted to smash the device, but Elena just went silent. She had survived that night once. Now, Damien was forcing her to relive it in the public eye. Marcus called within minutes. "We expected this," he said calmly. "Did we?" Elena asked, her voice quiet and hollow. Chloe could hear the crack in it. "Expecting a knife to come does not make it hurt any less when it cuts you." Marcus softened his tone. "No, it does not, but he made a fatal mistake. He put the attack in writing, and he used a clearly edited image. We can prove the full context. We can use it to establish his pattern of gaslighting." Elena closed her eyes, breathing deeply. "He is going to claim I stole the baby before she is born." "He can say it," Marcus replied. "That does not make it true." Damien's next move was even faster. His lawyers filed an emergency petition requesting a court-ordered welfare check, a psychiatric evaluation, and temporary restrictions on Elena's movement until the birth. Arthur hated the filing but signed it anyway because Damien threatened to replace him. The petition described Elena as isolated, emotionally overwhelmed, and influenced by hostile third parties. It included the cropped gala photograph as evidence of her instability. It did not mention Serafina, Paris, or the threats Damien had made in their study. Reading the document made Elena feel physically ill for the first time since leaving. She wondered if choosing to be brave had been a catastrophic mistake. The night air felt thick, heavy with the weight of her choices. As Elena stood alone in the small nursery within the safe house, it was a modest room, sparse compared to the opulent, designer penthouse nursery she had left behind, but it held a warmth that gold and marble never could. A simple wooden crib sat against the wall, a soft lamp cast a gentle amber glow, and a small framed print of wildflowers she had picked up at a roadside shop hung above the changing table. Elena slowly ran her fingertips along the smooth, cool wood of the crib rail, her breath hitching as she whispered to her unborn daughter. "I am trying," she promised into the quiet dark. "I need you to know that. I am trying to build a life where love is a choice, not a form of ownership." The baby kicked, a sudden, sharp flutter of life that made Elena laugh through her tears. That tiny movement offered her more genuine strength than any team of high-priced lawyers ever could. The emergency hearing arrived 2 days later, a cold and sterile event that felt like a trial of her entire existence. Damien walked in with a navy suit tailored to perfection, his face carefully arranged into a mask of deep, performative concern. Elena arrived through a side entrance, feeling the steadying presence of Chloe and Marcus beside her, while Rachel followed close behind, clutching a legal binder so thick it looked like it could bruise someone. As Damien caught sight of her across the courtroom, he nearly won the first silent psychological battle. She looked exhausted, visibly pregnant, and profoundly human, a stark contrast to the ice-cold, Impenetrable strategist he remembered from the private confines of his study. For a terrifying, fleeting moment, he believed the judge would see exactly what he intended her to see: a woman under immense pressure, a woman he could still define, control, and eventually discard. Judge Evelyn Hart possessed a reputation for being entirely unimpressed by wealth or status. She sat motionless, listening as Damien S. high-powered counsel painted a picture of Elena S.'s sudden disappearance as evidence of emotional instability and manipulation by outside actors. When the judge finally turned her gaze toward the defense, she asked simply for a response. Rachel stood up, cool and collected, and triggered the security recording pulled directly from the penthouse study. Damien's own voice suddenly filled the silent, echoing courtroom. "I will have you declared an unfit mother. I will take that baby. I will bury you." The energy in the room shifted instantly. Damien's carefully crafted veneer of concern collapsed into something far uglier and more desperate. Elena sat motionless at the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, forcing herself to stare at the wood grain rather than look at his face. Rachel followed the audio with the full, unedited footage from the gala. On the screen, Damien was shown callously dismissing Elena in front of important donors, pulling Serafina away, and leaving his pregnant wife standing alone under the harsh lights while photographers captured the sheer humiliation on her face. There was no trace of instability in her behavior, only the image of a husband using public politeness as a sharp blade. Elena felt every pair of eyes in the courtroom shift toward Damien, and for a second she wanted to vanish. Marcus leaned close, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Do not let him make his shame yours." Elena took a shaky, deep breath, lifted her chin with newfound resolve, and turned her full attention toward the judge. Rachel continued her presentation, meticulously submitting the therapist's letter, prenatal medical records, safe housing logs, and clear proof that Elena had notified legal counsel long before she moved. This was not an abandonment, Rachel explained. It was a carefully constructed safety plan. Damien's counsel jumped up to object, but Judge Hart promptly overruled him. When Damien was finally forced to take the stand and answer whether he had approved the article portraying Elena as mentally unfit, he offered a smile that was far too slow. "I was merely worried for my wife," he claimed. Marcus stood up immediately. "Then why did your publicist send the draft to Tara Reynolds directly from your office server?" The smile vanished from Damien's face instantly, leaving him exposed. The judge promptly denied Damien's emergency petition and issued a strict order forbidding him from making any further public comments regarding Elena's mental health. She also granted temporary legal protections surrounding Elena's location and her private medical care. It was not a total sweeping victory, but it was the first time a visible crack had appeared in the foundation of Damien's control. Outside the courthouse, the cameras screamed his name. He ignored them until one persistent reporter asked if he felt any regret for humiliating his pregnant wife at the gala. His jaw tightened visibly. "No comment," Arthur whispered into his ear. Damien offered no words, but the look of pure, unadulterated fury on his face said more than enough. For the first time, the press finally smelled blood in the water. Serafina watched the chaotic courthouse footage from her hotel room and felt the entire narrative shifting away from her control. In Damien's version of reality, she had no place. He was the devoted husband, Elena was the unstable victim, and the affair was kept entirely invisible. That meant Serafina was invisible, too. Unless someone decided they needed a villain to blame. She threw her phone onto the sofa in a rage. She had not climbed this high, only to become a mere footnote in someone else's messy divorce. Then the familiar wave of nausea rose again, sudden and sharp, forcing her to scramble toward the bathroom. When she finally returned, she stood in front of the mirror, staring at the small discarded pregnancy test she had hidden deep inside her makeup bag. Serafina had discovered the truth while they were in Paris. She had originally planned to reveal it to Damien only after the big deal closed, when he was relaxed, sentimental, and more likely to see the idea of a child as a mark of destiny rather than a complication. But now, the world was collapsing around them. If she told him, would he actually protect her? Or would he simply blame her for the added pressure? She thought of Elena, pregnant and publicly humiliated, and felt a cold, sharp flash of something she refused to name. It was not sympathy exactly. It was recognition. Damien had promised both women entirely different futures, and she realized both of those futures depended entirely on them staying useful to him. Her phone suddenly rang, displaying an unknown number. Ms. Dubois. The voice on the other end was smooth, masculine, and intensely controlled. "This is Marcus Thorne. I represent Elena Vance." Serafina felt the urge to hang up immediately. "I have nothing to say to you," she snapped. "That is truly unfortunate," Marcus replied, "because Damien is currently building a public narrative where his wife is unstable. He is the innocent party, and you are either entirely irrelevant or disposable. I imagine neither version of that story serves your interests." Serafina went perfectly still. Marcus continued, "We have gathered photographs, messages, and hotel records. You are not just a rumor. Ms. Dubois, you are evidence. You are threatening me," she said, her voice trembling. "I am simply explaining your current position," he replied. "Damien will not save you. He cannot even save himself at this point." Serafina laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "And you think Elena will? My client has no interest in punishing you for Damien's lies," Marcus said, his voice even. "But she will do whatever is necessary to protect her child from anyone who helps him destroy her reputation. If you tell the truth, we can discuss a protected statement and limited confidentiality. If you stay silent, Damien will make sure you are the only woman blamed for everything." Serafina sat down slowly. For once in her life, she had absolutely no clever answer. Her deposition lasted 4 grueling hours. At first, she tried to maintain an air of detachment, acting sophisticated and far above the petty scandal. Then Marcus pulled out the draft article Damien's legal team had prepared for the second leak. It referred to an unnamed European socialite who had allegedly exploited a vulnerable businessman during a difficult marital period. Serafina read the sentence twice, her face pale. Her voice changed entirely after that. She detailed everything: Paris, Lake Como, Damien's private apartment, the hollow promises he made, the specific plans to divorce Elena after the birth of the child. She even recounted the Helios Gen conversations he had after too much wine, when his arrogance finally loosened his tongue. Damien learned about the deposition from Arthur, who looked as though he had aged a decade in just 1 week. "She gave them everything," Arthur said, his voice devoid of hope. "She said you told her the patent problem was already handled. She said you used the phrase creative acquisition." Damien began pacing his office, his mind racing. "She is lying," he barked. Arthur did not argue. He simply didn't have the energy left to fight. "Damien, you need to settle. The custody attack failed. The press leak tied directly back to our office. Serafina is cooperating fully, and Justin Thorne is currently circling the board." Damien stopped dead. "The board has nothing to do with this," he insisted. That afternoon, Damien called a private board meeting without any warning. He arrived with a perfectly prepared speech about hostile litigation, the distraction of his marital issues, and opportunistic rivals looking to exploit a private matter. For 20 long minutes, he performed his usual display of absolute control. Some of the directors nodded, mostly because they had made fortunes under his leadership and feared what might happen if he were gone. Then, Marjorie Vale, the oldest member of the board and the only person Damien had never fully intimidated, asked a single quiet question. "Is there any criminal exposure connected to Helios Gen?" Damien smiled, cold and sharp. "Absolutely not." Marjorie looked down at the folder in front of her. "Then why did Justin Thorne just request emergency access to our patent files?" The air in the meeting room turned icy. Damien insisted that Justin was just using the divorce to sabotage the company. Marjorie countered by asking for independent counsel to review the books. 2 other directors immediately supported her. Damien threatened resignations, funding freezes, and severe personal consequences for anyone who opposed him. But the more he spoke, the less powerful he seemed to the people in the room. Power depended on people believing you could still protect them, and that illusion was gone. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to retain outside investigators. Damien walked out, smiling for the cameras. But inside, He understood the reality. Elena had not just attacked his marriage. She had opened doors he had spent years locking. Justin Thorne appeared in Damien's office the very next morning without an appointment. He wore no tie, just a simple charcoal coat, and the weary expression of a man who had waited 2 long years for the chance to enter that room. Damien looked up from his desk, his eyes dark. "Get out," he commanded. Justin simply closed the door behind him and took a steady breath. "You know, I imagined this moment differently," he said quietly. "I thought I would enjoy it much more than this." Damien stood up, his posture rigid. "If you are here because of my wife, you are making a massive mistake." Justin offered a faint, sad smile. "Your wife is the only reason this is still civil." Damien's eyes narrowed into slits. "Are you sleeping with her?" Justin's laugh was short, sharp, and entirely humorless. "You really do have a small, pathetic imagination," he said. "Not every man looks at a woman and sees a possession to be owned. Elena came to me because she found a secret ledger in your study. She thought it proved you were hiding money from her. It did. But it also proved you had paid off the people connected to the theft of my patent." Damien's face tightened, his mask slipping. "She had no idea what she was looking at," he countered. Justin stepped closer. "At first, no, but then she learned." Justin told him exactly how Elena had approached him after the Met Gala, quietly and without any sense of drama. She did not ask him to ruin Damien out of spite. She simply asked what a Cayman transfer to a former energy engineer might mean for a business. Justin had stared at the document for a full minute before realizing the lonely, pregnant woman standing in front of him was holding the missing piece of a case he had nearly given up on entirely. "I asked her what she wanted," Justin said. "She said, 'I want my child safe. Not rich, not famous, just safe.'" Damien looked away first, the silence of the room crushing him. "You used her," Damien snapped, his voice barely a whisper in the silence of the room. Justin didn't blink. "I did not use her," he replied, his tone steady and cold. "I respected her. And that is a fundamental difference you have never managed to understand." Damien shoved his chair back and circled the mahogany desk, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "You honestly think you can seize my company just because my wife is angry?" Justin's gaze turned to iron. "I think your entire company was built on a foundation of stolen tech, hidden payments, and raw fear. Elena did not create that corruption. She discovered it. And now, every single person you bullied into silence knows the wall is finally cracking." Damien felt a surge of rage, wanting to lash out, but he simply adjusted his cufflink, a pathetic, hollow reflex of control that fooled no one, safe within the walls of the house. Elena listened to Marcus outline the board's latest investigation and felt absolutely no sense of triumph. Chloe had expected her to feel relief, maybe even a wave of dark satisfaction. But Elena felt the complete opposite. If this fraud case actually went public, Damien would likely face prison time for months. That thought had been purely theoretical, like a dangerous weapon kept locked behind thick glass. Now it was becoming a cold, hard reality. And Elena hated the part of herself that still cared if he suffered. "He is the father of my child," she whispered. Marcus didn't try to correct her. "Legally, perhaps not for much longer," he conceded. "But biologically, yes, that matters." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then you must decide what kind of justice you can live with." That night, Elena sat on the edge of her bed and opened an old, dusty photo album she had almost left behind in the wreckage of their marriage. Their wedding night looked like something pulled straight from a Hollywood movie. Thousands of white roses, a world-class string quartet, and Damien smiling as if he had never told a lie in his entire life. She stared at a picture of him gently touching her cheek during their first dance. She remembered how she had once believed that gesture meant true tenderness. Now, she realized it had always been about ownership. She closed the album sharply when the baby kicked. "No," she whispered, not to Damien, not to herself, but to the child inside her. "You will not inherit my confusion. You will never be a possession." Damien's next attempt at a strike was significantly uglier. He sent a massive check to Elena's mother, disguised as a fake consulting payment, and asked her to issue a public statement claiming that Elena had always been emotionally delicate and prone to episodes. Her mother, Patricia Vance, had spent her entire life choosing personal comfort over conflict, and Damien assumed she would fold like a cheap suit. Instead, Patricia called Elena in tears. "I did not take the money," she said, her voice shaking. "I wanted to. God forgive me. I really wanted to, but I did not." Elena listened, surprised by the sudden, sharp ache in her chest. "Thank you, Mother," Patricia whispered back. "I failed you before. Not this time." The failed bribe quickly became another sworn affidavit in the growing file. Marcus added it to the stack, his expression unreadable. Damien went into a blind rage when Arthur finally broke the news to him, even her own mother. Arthur sat across from him, looking older and more exhausted than ever. "You need to understand something, Damien. People are changing sides because they finally realize you cannot protect them anymore." Damien's expression turned deadly. "Then make them afraid again." Arthur didn't answer. That was the exact moment he realized Damien wasn't trying to save his marriage, his company, or even his child. He was trying to punish everyone who witnessed him losing his grip on his power. The second court hearing was focused entirely on custody protections and public conduct. Damien arrived, carefully groomed and prepared to look calm, but Marcus had structured the morning like a slow, crushing trap. First came the recording from the penthouse, then the trail of leaked articles, then Patricia's affidavit, then a detailed statement from Dr. Mann explaining how extreme public stress could directly affect Elena's pregnancy. Damien's lawyer frantically argued that Elena was using the baby as leverage. Judge Hart slowly removed her glasses and looked directly at Damien. "Mr. Blackwood, the court is far less concerned with your wife's strategy than with your repeated attempts to control the narrative by damaging her mental health record." The judge issued a strict order for Damien to cease all direct contact, public statements, and any attempt to locate Elena outside of counsel-approved channels. Any violation would risk severe sanctions and impact his future visitation rights. Damien stood completely still, his face a hollow mask. Reporters crowded the hallways outside, waiting for a comment. This time, he said absolutely nothing. But inside the car, he grabbed Arthur by the lapel, his knuckles white. "Fix this." Arthur looked at his client's hand, then stared into his eyes. "I have protected you for 15 years, he said quietly. "I can defend mistakes. I cannot defend a man who keeps making new ones while the judge is watching." Serafina's cooperation did not grant her a clean conscience or a lack of fear. Marcus had never promised her friendship. He had only promised her clear legal boundaries. When she finally confessed that she was pregnant, the entire room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Marcus asked how far along she was. Serafina stared down at the table. "Not very far. Maybe Paris. Maybe before it is Damien's." Marcus's expression remained unchanged, but something in his eyes seemed to sharpen. "My client will need to know this." Serafina's face twisted in pain. "She will hate me for this." Marcus calmly closed his folder. "Elena has much better things to do than hate you." When Marcus finally relayed the news to Elena, she sat very still, processing the information. Chloe reacted first, her voice rising in disbelief. "That woman is pregnant. After everything he has done." Elena looked out the window at the tall trees bending violently in the wind. The first feeling she experienced wasn't anger. It was a strange, deep sense of exhaustion. Damien had left wreckage everywhere he went and expected the women in his life to bleed quietly around his mistakes. "Is the child safe?" Elena finally asked. Marcus studied her intently. "You are asking about Serafina's baby." "I am asking about a child," Elena said. "Not because Serafina deserves my kindness, but because that child does not deserve Damien's chaos." That specific answer changed Marcus's entire approach. He had fully expected Elena to use the news of Serafina's pregnancy as political leverage, perhaps even as a form of public humiliation. Instead, Elena immediately asked about setting up a trust. Anonymous, carefully controlled, enough to keep the child secure and healthy, but not enough to let Serafina profit from the looming scandal. Chloe stared at her, stunned. "You are actually protecting her." Elena shook her head slowly. "I am preventing Damien from using yet another child as a weapon against someone else. There is a massive difference." Her voice remained calm, but as soon as Marcus left, she retreated to the bathroom and cried until her throat burned. The final settlement meeting took place at Blackwood Industries because Damien flatly refused to step foot in Marcus S. office again. That small, petty demand was the only thing he had managed to win in weeks. He sat at the head of the massive boardroom table, under a wall-sized photograph of the Company S first headquarters, trying to look like a man still in absolute command. Arthur sat beside him, completely silent. Marcus entered the room with Justin, Rachel, and an outside forensic accountant. Elena was not there. Her absence felt less like weakness to everyone present. It felt like distance from a fire she had already ignited. Marcus placed 2 folders on the table with a firm thud. Blue for the divorce, red for corporate exposure. The blue folder contains the revised family settlement, he explained. The red folder contains enough financial evidence to support multiple referrals for wire fraud, securities violations, and a criminal conspiracy related to the Helios Gen acquisition. Damien looked at Arthur, but Arthur did not look back. Justin spoke next, his voice clear. The Board's independent review has already confirmed these irregularities. They are currently waiting to see if you resign quietly or force them to remove you publicly. Damien's smile was brittle. You rehearsed that, Justin replied. I waited 2 long years to say it. The terms had shifted dramatically. Elena would receive $200 million in liquid assets, the penthouse, the Hamptons estate, and full sole custody. A trust for Aria Grace Vance would hold 49% of Damien's company shares. After the divorce was finalized, Elena would sell those shares to Justin's investment group under a prearranged agreement, finally giving Justin a decisive position in the company. Damien would be forced to resign as CEO, accept a very limited severance package, and sign a lifetime non-disparagement and confidentiality agreement regarding Elena, Aria, and the settlement. He would waive all parental claims unless Elena later consented through court. Never, Damien said. His voice was dangerously quiet now, which made the threat feel significantly worse. You are asking me to completely erase myself from my daughter's life. Rachel looked at him, unfazed. No, Mr. Blackwood. Your own choices brought us to this exact moment. This agreement simply protects her from the inevitable consequences of your behavior. Damien turned his attention to Marcus. You actually think a judge is going to let this stand? Marcus nodded once. After the threats, the smear campaign, the failed bribe, the hidden assets, the gala footage, and the pending fraud issues. Yes, and if you contest it, we file the red folder by 5 p.m. sharp. Damien looked over at Justin. This is what you always wanted. My company. Justin's face did not soften in the slightest. I wanted back what you stole from me. Elena simply wanted peace. You made both of those things very expensive. Arthur finally spoke up. Damien, just sign it. The room went deathly still. Damien turned toward his longtime lawyer slowly. Arthur's voice shook, but he did not stop. I am telling you this as the man who wrote your prenup, defended your dirtiest deals, and cleaned up your messes. Sign the papers. Leave with what you can take if you choose to fight this. You will not leave this room with your freedom. Marcus pushed a high-end pen across the smooth surface of the table. You have exactly 1 hour. At the end of that hour, we either receive your signatures or we proceed with the filing. Everyone exited the room except for Arthur. Damien stared down at the folders as a heavy rain began tapping rhythmically against the boardroom windows. It sounded exactly like the night Elena had left him. For a long time, neither man spoke. Then Damien said, "Did you really know she was capable of this?" Arthur leaned back, looking older than Damien had ever seen him. "I knew she was intelligent. You insisted she was harmless. Those were never the same thing." Damien almost signed the documents after 20 minutes of silence. Then his private phone rang. The number was blocked. He answered it, driven by a desperation that makes even the most arrogant men turn superstitious. "Damien," Serafina sobbed through the line. "You have to help me. They used me." Damien's mouth hardened instantly. "You betrayed me," he hissed. "No," she countered. "You did that first." He almost hung up, but then she said the one thing that truly froze him in his seat. "I am pregnant. It is yours." Damien looked at the settlement papers, at the line where he was supposed to sign away his rights to one child, while another appeared like a final, ironic punishment from the universe. Serafina's voice was thin, sharp with a panic that seemed to rattle the very air between them. She explained that Marcus had sent over a formal agreement, one that felt like a cage disguised as a lifeline, an anonymous trust fund for the baby, medical care, and a ticket to relocate to Geneva, provided she vanished entirely. No contact with Damien, no contact with Elena, and certainly none with Arya. The threat was cold and calculated. If she refused, Damien's legal team would use her own deposition to prove she helped Elena smear a pregnant woman, turning it into a weapon to strip away her custody rights. Damien stared into the distance, eyes squeezed shut. So Elena had successfully bought her silence. Serafina laughed, a jagged, wet sound through her tears. She told him that Elena hadn't bought silence. She had bought her child a life away from him. The words landed like a physical blow. Damien stayed silent, unable to retort, because the ugly truth was that this accusation was also the only mercy left. The call ended, leaving Damien in a crushing, suffocating silence that lasted until the final hour of his leverage expired. His mind drifted back to the early days with Elena, before the glass-walled penthouses and the constant glare of cameras. Back when she still asked him about his fears and genuinely waited for his answers. He realized now that he had made a series of catastrophic miscalculations. He had mistaken her kindness for weakness, her quiet patience for permission to treat her as an object, and her pregnancy for a form of permanent captivity. Now, every single one of those mistakes had come back to collect, and the interest was ruinous. When Marcus finally stepped back into the room, his expression unreadable, Damien picked up the pen. His hand trembled, a small, involuntary tremor he could not suppress. He signed the divorce settlement first, the paper feeling heavy under his fingers, then the resignation, then the transfer of shares. It was the end. Each signature he scribbled onto the pages looked nothing like the bold, commanding mark he usually displayed. It was uneven, shaky, almost small, a signature stripped of its authority. Marcus didn't offer a word, checking each document with a cold, mechanical precision that made the reality sink in even deeper. Justin stood by the window, his posture rigid and his silence heavy with judgment. Arthur wouldn't even look his way. Damien had braced himself for some grand, dramatic eruption of feeling when the final tether was cut. He expected to feel a surge of rage, a crushing weight of grief, or perhaps a sharp acidic relief. Instead, he felt absolutely hollow, like a statue that had been gutted from the inside. He had spent years saturating every room he entered with his will, forcing his presence into every corner, and now the room simply had no use for him anymore. Marcus gathered the papers. "Mr. Blackwood, the agreements are effective now. Security will escort you to your office." Hours later, Damien found himself wandering through the relentless rain, having cast aside his driver and his security team in a pathetic display of pride. He had refused the company car, only to realize with a bitter jolt that he had nowhere left to go that actually felt like his. The penthouse was Elena's now. The estate in the Hamptons belonged to Elena. The private jet was grounded, frozen in legal limbo pending transfer. Even his own office was currently under heavy guard. He drifted aimlessly until he found himself standing directly across the street from Serafina's apartment building on the Upper West Side. With no memory of even deciding to walk there, he lied to himself, telling his racing mind that he was searching for answers. The truth was far darker. He was looking for someone who had less power than he did, someone he could blame for the wreckage of his life. A sleek black Mercedes glided to the curb just before he could step into the street. Two security guards exited the vehicle with practiced, intimidating efficiency. Then Marcus Thorne appeared, opening the rear door with a steady hand. Elena emerged into the damp air, draped in a dark wool coat that was perfectly tailored around her 8-month pregnancy. The sight of her stopped Damien's heart. He had not seen her since that final, devastating confrontation in the study. She looked different, not just physically, but because the heavy shroud of fear that once defined her posture had vanished entirely. She looked exhausted. Yes, but beneath that, she looked profoundly, undeniably free. Marcus stood protectively at her side, while the guards kept their eyes locked on Damien, ready to react to the slightest shift in his mood. "Elena," he called out, the name tearing from his throat like a raw, desperate prayer. She paused, her movement fluid. Marcus shifted his body to shield her, but she reached out, placing a firm, steadying hand on his arm. "It is fine," she whispered. She looked across the rain-slicked street at Damien, soaked to the bone, unshaven, and looking nearly unrecognizable. For a fleeting second, the old, ingrained reflex sparked inside her, the familiar urge to prioritize his comfort over her own. Then the baby kicked, a sharp, physical reminder of reality, and the reflex dissolved. Damien surged forward. "Please," he begged. "Not the company. Not the baby, my child." Elena's face remained a mask of calm, but her eyes, those beautiful, once soft eyes, had sharpened into something as cold as steel. "You already signed the papers, Damien." "He forced me to sign," Damien shouted, his finger trembling as he pointed a shaking hand toward Marcus. It was pure blackmail. Elena shook her head slowly, her expression unimpressed. "It was never blackmail, Damien. It was a choice. You chose the value of a patent over the value of basic human honesty. You chose your own ego over the responsibility of fatherhood. You chose to label me as unstable instead of having the courage to admit you were the one hurting me. Every time a path opened up that led back to decency, you chose to lock that door yourself." Damien's mouth twisted into a snarl. "And what about Serafina? Are you proud of how you treated her? She is carrying my child." For the first time, a look of profound disgust flickered across Elena's face. It wasn't the heat of jealousy. It was the cold, hollow disgust of a person seeing something truly beneath them. "I did not do this to Serafina," Elena said, her voice steady and clear above the hum of the city. "You did that all by yourself. I simply made sure her child would not be the one punished for your actions. The trust is funded to handle everything: medical care, housing, education, and protection. She is going to raise that baby far away from you, far away from me, and entirely away from the toxic war you created." Damien stared at her, stunned by the cold logic. "You are sending her into exile. I am giving her the chance you never—" "Not once, to me," Elena replied. "Peace." Without your shadow looming over the crib, Marcus stepped toward him. "Mr. Blackwood, you are dangerously close to violating the agreement. Leave this place, right now." Damien ignored the guard, his eyes locked solely on Elena. "Did you ever actually love me?" The question hung in the air, surprising them both with its sudden, raw vulnerability. The rain streamed down his face, washing away his groomed image and making him look younger, more ruined, and far more broken than she ever wanted him to appear. Elena didn't answer instantly. That was perhaps the final kindness she could offer him. "Yes," she said eventually, "I loved the man I believed you were, then. I loved the version of you that I thought you could become. Finally, I loved my child enough to stop waiting for either one of those men to show up." Damien flinched as if struck. Elena turned away toward the building entrance. "Goodbye, Damien," he called after her, his voice cracking with the desperation of a man who suddenly realized he was alone. "Wait, just tell me one thing. Was there ever a moment, even one, when I could have changed this?" She turned back, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. "Yes," she said, "there were hundreds. The very first time you chose to lie. The first time you decided to humiliate me. The first time I wept in front of you, and you dismissed it as nothing but drama. The first time you prioritized power, when a single act of kindness would have cost you nothing. You didn't lose me in one single night, Damien. You lost me every time you expected me to survive the damage you refused to repair." Damien was silenced, his usual arsenal of manipulation failing to find a foothold. Elena's tone softened, which somehow cut deeper than any anger ever could. "I never wanted to destroy you," she said. "I only wanted you to stop. I wanted you to come home to us before I had to transform into someone who was capable of fighting you. But you never came home, Damien. You only returned to the places you owned, and I am not one of them anymore." The guards took a step forward, their presence a physical barrier. Damien lowered his head, the weight of it suddenly too much to carry. Elena walked into the lobby without a backward glance. The heavy doors clicked shut behind her, and in that definitive sound, he finally understood. The silence wasn't a punishment. It was her freedom. Inside the safety of the lobby, Elena allowed herself one deep, shaking breath. Marcus stood nearby, watching her with a cautious, protective eye. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No," she admitted, "but I am safe, and tonight, that is enough." She had come here not to gloat or revel in his downfall, but to ensure the legal agreement was handled and the relocation plan was solidified. She knew Serafina didn't want to see her, and she didn't blame her. Some meetings would only serve to reopen wounds that were finally starting to heal. Still, as she prepared to leave, she checked with Marcus one last time about the medical team in Geneva. He gave a sharp nod. "It is already taken care of." 2 weeks before her due date, Damien made one final, flailing attempt to reclaim his grip on reality. He flew to Dubai, desperate to secure private backing to challenge his removal from the board, claiming he had been forced out by a malicious family conspiracy. The investors listened with polite, empty faces until independent counsel forwarded them the sealed summaries of his fraud evidence. Within hours, the meetings vanished from his calendar. Men who used to scramble to answer his calls in seconds now sent assistants to deliver excuses about traveling. Damien was finally learning a lesson he had never believed while he was on top. Silence from the powerful is just a verdict that has already been reached. Back in New York, the Blackwood name was dismantled from the tower before the sun even rose. Workers removed the letters one by one, while news cameras swarmed the street below. By noon, the signage read Helios Innovations. Justin Thorne stood in the center of the lobby, surrounded by executives who had spent years paralyzed by their fear of Damien, and now faced an uncertain future with a different kind of intensity. He didn't offer a triumphant speech. He simply stated that the company would fully cooperate with all investigators, return to ethical governance, and begin the long work of rebuilding what had been stolen. Then he called Elena, who was resting on the doctor's orders. "It is done," he told her. Elena didn't watch the news broadcast. She was in bed, her ankles swollen, clutching a cup of ginger tea while Chloe sat beside her, meticulously assembling a baby monitor with the concentration of a bomb disposal expert. When Justin S. call came through, Elena put him on speaker. "The name is down," he confirmed. "The board vote is official. Damien is out." Chloe raised both fists in a silent, joyful salute. Elena closed her eyes, letting out a long breath. She had imagined she would feel a rush of victory, but instead, she felt a profound sense of release, like a door clicking shut behind her. "Good," she said softly. Then she added, "Are the employees safe?" Justin smiled into the phone. "That is so like you." Labor began on a crisp, gray autumn morning. Elena woke before the sun to a pain that was unmistakable, deep, rhythmic, and constant, as if her body had finally decided the internal war was over enough to let new life arrive. Chloe drove the car with Marcus following behind, and 2 security vehicles keeping a careful distance. Elena almost laughed through the contractions at the absurdity of the scene. Most women packed hospital bags with comfort items. She had a full legal team and a security detail trailing her. But when a sharp contraction hit, none of that mattered. She wasn't a strategist anymore. She was just a mother trying to focus on her next breath. Inside the delivery room, Elena insisted that everyone except Chloe leave during the most intense phase. She didn't want lawyers, guards, or the ghost of victory anywhere near that bed. She wanted one hand to hold and one voice to tell her she could make it through. Chloe cried openly, which made Elena laugh, then curse, then laugh again until tears streamed down her face. When the baby finally arrived, the sound of her first, piercing cry shattered something open inside Elena that no settlement or court ruling could ever touch. Aria Grace Vance was placed onto her chest, warm, furious, and vibrantly alive. Elena held her close, whispering, "We finally made it." For a long time there was no Damien, no legal court, no corporate company, and no public scandal. There was only the heavy, beautiful weight of a tiny body against her heart and the strange, holy quiet that follows intense pain. Aria S. small fingers curled around Elena S. thumb with a grip that was surprisingly strong. Chloe touched the baby S. dark hair and began to cry even harder. "She is perfect, Elena." Elena smiled, her face lined with exhaustion but glowing with peace. "She is free," she said. The word meant more to her than perfect ever could. Perfect was just another cage that women were praised into. Free was the inheritance she had fought to give her daughter. Marcus arrived hours later with Justin, both carrying flowers and the careful, lingering awkwardness of two men stepping into a world newly redefined by the arrival of an infant. Marcus lingered near the entryway, uncharacteristically quiet, his gaze shifting around as if searching for a threat that was no longer there. Justin looked at Arya with a profound intensity, his expression suggesting that the baby had somehow rearranged his entire understanding of victory and success. "The floor is secure," Marcus said, his voice barely a murmur. "No press, no leaks." The final decree arrived at 9. Elena nodded, her eyes bright and searching. "Is everything truly complete?" Marcus handed over a thick, cream-colored envelope. Inside were the documents that mattered: divorce decree, custody order, trust confirmation, property transfers, and Damien's final compliance certification. "It is officially over." Elena carefully opened the envelope with one hand while Arya dozed peacefully in the other. The pages inside were crisp, professional, and undeniably cold. Dissolution of marriage, sole custody, Vance family trust, $200 million transferred into private, managed accounts. The penthouse and Hampton's estate officially recorded in her name alone. Strict non-contact orders in place. Damien's resignation finally accepted. Elena read every line slowly, not because she questioned the validity of the documents, but because she needed her physical self to believe what her mind had known for months. The marriage was finished. The cage she had lived in for so long now had a door, and for the first time in years, she had finally walked through it. "And Damien?" she asked, her voice steady. Marcus answered with deliberate care, choosing his words as if they were fragile. "He left the United States yesterday. Dubai first, possibly Singapore after that. He possesses enough capital to live comfortably, but he has no controlling stake, no board position, and absolutely no access to you or Arya. He will likely attempt to rebuild somewhere. Men like him usually do." Elena looked down at her daughter, noticing the tiny, perfect curve of her eyelashes. "Let him," she whispered. The words held no trace of rage. That actually surprised her. For months, cold anger had kept her upright. Now holding Arya, that anger felt impossibly heavy. She realized she did not need to carry it into this room anymore. "What about Serafina?" Elena asked, her gaze lifting back to them. Justin answered this time, his tone respectful. "She signed everything. The Geneva arrangements are complete. The trust is funded. Her medical team is in place, and the agreement strictly bars public statements, contact, or any claims against you and Arya." She sent one final message through counsel. Chloe stiffened, her protective instincts flaring. Elena looked up. What did it say? Marcus hesitated for a second, then read from his phone screen. She said, "I will not ask for forgiveness. I know I do not deserve it. But I understand now that he lied to us both. Tell Elena I will keep my child far from him." Elena listened without a hint of expression on her face. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Good." Chloe stared at her, clearly stunned. "That is all." Elena brushed a fingertip over Arya's cheek, feeling the softness of her skin. "That is all." There was a time when she had imagined confronting Serafina, demanding elaborate explanations, maybe watching the shame cross the other woman's face. But motherhood had changed the scale of everything for her. Serafina had done wrong. Elena knew that. But Damien had built the lie, fed the lie, and benefited from it. 2 babies were entering the world because of his selfishness. Elena refused to let either one become a weapon in his games. Justin moved slightly closer to the bed, still maintaining a respectful, professional distance. "You should know the board wants to issue a formal public statement praising your cooperation." "No," Elena said immediately. Justin blinked, looking surprised. "No, I do not want to be turned into a symbol by the same group of people who would have ignored me if Damien had won," she explained. "The company can say it is moving forward. It does not need to use my name." Marcus looked almost amused by her resolve. "You realize people will talk anyway." Elena smiled faintly. "People always talk. I no longer organize my life around being understood by strangers or seeking their approval." In another country, Damien watched the rebranding ceremony on a muted television in a hotel suite that felt both luxurious and temporary. The sound was off, but he did not need the audio to understand what had occurred. His name was gone from the building. Justin stood in the position where Damien should have stood. Reporters called him disgraced. Embattled and removed, he poured a drink, then left it untouched on the glass table, for the first time in years. No assistant knocked at his door. No lawyer called with solutions. No mistress waited in the bedroom. No wife waited at home. He finally had the privacy he once craved, and it felt exactly like exile. He opened an encrypted folder on his laptop and discovered an old photo of Elena from their honeymoon. She was standing barefoot on a balcony in Capri, laughing at something just outside the frame. Damien barely remembered taking the picture. Back then, he had believed that possession was the natural end of desire. You loved someone, you married them, you placed them inside your life, and they became part of the architecture. He understood much too late that Elena had never been architecture. She had been a living, breathing person trapped in rooms he designed to make her smaller, more controlled, and ultimately invisible. A message from Arthur arrived that evening. "I am resigning as your counsel. I recommend you retain criminal defense immediately." Damien read the short message twice. Arthur had been with him through hostile takeovers, quiet settlements, and scandals that never became public news. Losing him felt less like losing a lawyer and more like losing the last witness, who was willing to pretend that Damien was still inevitable. He typed 3 different replies and deleted every single one of them. In the end, he sent nothing at all. Silence had become the only language everyone used with him now. He had taught them that. In his own twisted way, Elena spent the first week after Aria's birth learning how quiet a new life could truly be. It was not peaceful every single moment. There were long midnight feedings, sore muscles, sudden tears that came for no clear reason, and moments when fear returned unexpectedly, like a heavy door slamming in another room. But the fear no longer possessed Damien's cold voice. Chloe stayed with her, providing a steady anchor. Patricia came twice and cried over the crib, without asking for the forgiveness that Elena was not quite ready to give. Marcus handled the final legalities. Justin sent books instead of flowers. Slowly, the world began to feel human again. One afternoon, Elena returned to the penthouse for the first time since she had left. She brought Aria, Chloe, and a professional moving team. The space looked exactly as it had before, which made it feel even stranger. Marble floors, glass walls, Damien's imposing study, the grand salon where she had once smiled for guests while dying quietly inside. Chloe asked if she wanted to sell the place immediately. Elena looked around for a long moment, taking it all in. "No," she said, "not yet. First, I want to change it." She walked into Damien's study, opened the heavy curtains fully, and told the movers to remove the massive desk. The desk was so heavy that it took 6 men to carry it out. Elena watched from the doorway with Aria sleeping soundly against her chest. That desk had been designed to make people feel small and powerless. As it disappeared into the elevator, Elena felt a small, unexpected laugh rise in her throat. Chloe grinned at her. "What are you putting there instead?" Elena looked at the empty space, now flooded with warm afternoon light. "A playroom," she said. Chloe laughed. "It is perfect." Elena smiled down at her daughter. The room that had once held threats and lies would now hold colorful blocks, storybooks, and tiny delicate shoes. Months passed. The legal noise faded into occasional headlines, then settled into the background. Blackwood Industries became Helios Innovations, and Justin proved himself to be a much steadier leader than Damien had ever been. He returned stolen research credits, settled fairly with engineers who had been silenced, and kept Elena's name out of public statements, just as he had promised. He visited Aria often enough to become a familiar face, but never enough to presume upon her time. Chloe teased Elena about the way Justin looked at her, but Elena always changed the subject. She was not ready to turn survival into romance. She was still learning how to belong to herself. One evening, Justin brought over a small, handcrafted wooden music box he had found at an antique shop. "For Aria," he said softly. "It is not expensive, just old and stubborn, like good things should be." Elena wound the mechanism and let the soft, rhythmic tune fill the nursery. Aria waved her tiny fists as if she were conducting a symphony. Elena laughed, and Justin watched her with an expression that made the entire room feel warmer. "Thank you," she said. For the music box or the company, he asked. For knowing the difference between helping and owning, Elena replied. Justin accepted that answer like the gift it truly was. Damien's criminal exposure did not completely disappear, but it narrowed significantly after several settlements and cooperation agreements. He avoided prison, though he did not escape the consequences of his past. Regulators fined him heavily. Investors abandoned him. Former allies gave interviews about his temper, his arrogance, and his habit of confusing fear with actual respect. He tried to launch a new fund overseas, but the Blackwood name no longer opened every door. Sometimes, late at night, he searched for photos of Elena and Arya online. There were almost none to be found. That bothered him more than the insults. He had lost access not only to them but to their story. Serafina gave birth in Geneva to a son she named Lucien. Elena heard through Marcus that both mother and child were healthy. She did not ask for pictures. She did not send a gift with her name attached, but she quietly approved an increase in the trust after learning the baby had needed extra medical care. Chloe said nothing when Elena signed the paperwork. Some kindnesses are simply too complicated for easy praise or explanation. Elena did not do it for Serafina. She did it because children should not have to pay interest on the sins their parents committed. It was a matter of principle, not a gesture of friendship. On Arya's first birthday, Elena held a small private gathering at the Hamptons estate. No photographers, no society pages, just Chloe, Patricia, Marcus, Justin, a few nurses who had helped during the hardest weeks, and a cake Arya mostly destroyed with both her hands. The house felt entirely different now, not like a trophy or a cage, like a place where people could breathe. Patricia watched Elena across the lawn and finally said the words she had avoided for so many years. "I am sorry I taught you to be polite instead of protected." Elena looked at her mother. "Then teach Arya differently with me," she said. That night, once the last guest had finally departed and the house fell silent, Elena carried little Arya down toward the dark, rhythmic pull of the beach. The child was sleepy, her body warm and heavy against her shoulder, breathing in soft, steady rhythms. Out on the water, the waves crashed in the dark, while the sky remained clear enough to reveal a sprawling, scattered map of stars. Elena found herself thinking back to the woman she had been the night Damien returned from Paris, that terrified soul sitting behind his desk, with fear locked tight behind her teeth. She wanted to reach back through time, to find that version of herself, and simply hold her hand, not because that woman was weak, but because she had been so utterly alone. Arya stirred against her, and Elena pressed a soft kiss to her hair. "You were never truly alone," she whispered into the cool night air. A year after the dust settled on the divorce, Elena officially founded the Vance Family Initiative, a private fund dedicated to supporting women who were trying to escape financially controlling marriages. Marcus was instrumental, helping to structure the legal side of things, while Chloe took charge of community outreach. Even Patricia contributed, volunteering quietly each week, filing endless piles of paperwork, and making warm coffee for women who arrived looking just as frightened as Elena once had. The fund did not rely on Elena's public scandal for its advertising. It never needed to. Word traveled quickly through the quiet networks of lawyers, therapists, shelters, and whispered phone calls between women who still slept beside men they feared. Elena never gave speeches about empowerment. She paid legal retainers, secured safe apartments, and made escape a practical reality. When a reporter finally cornered her and asked why she had created the initiative, Elena gave one of her only public answers. "Because leaving is not just one brave, sudden moment," she explained. "It is 1,000 expensive, complicated details." People ended up quoting that line for weeks. But Elena knew the gritty truth behind it was anything but elegant. It was about passports hidden inside diaper bags, bank statements quietly copied at midnight, friends who were willing to answer the phone, lawyers who actually believed your story, and having enough money for a lock that no one else had the key to. Freedom might look beautiful from far away, but up close, it was mostly mountains of tedious paperwork, careful planning, and the quiet, steady courage to keep going. Years later, people would inevitably simplify the story until it barely resembled the truth. They would claim Elena took half his empire as a trophy. They would say the wife finally destroyed the cheating billionaire. They would say the mistress betrayed him, the lawyer trapped him, and the rival stole his company. They would be partly right, but mostly wrong about how it happened. Elena did not win because she was colder than Damien. She won because she finally stopped protecting his comfort at the absolute cost of her own safety. She gathered hard facts. She found loyal allies. She felt the crushing weight of fear and moved forward anyway. That was not coldness. That was survival, combined with the kind of iron discipline that Damien never saw coming. On the day of Aria's 5th birthday, Elena finally told her daughter a gentle, careful version of the truth. She left out the sordid affair, the court recordings, the red folders, and the dark threats. She simply said, "Some people think love means keeping others small, and some people choose to leave so that their children can grow tall." Aria listened with a serious expression, then asked if her father was a bad man. Elena breathed carefully, choosing her words. "He made choices that ended up hurting people. That is what I know to be true." Aria nodded, accepting only what a child could hold in her heart. Then, with the resilience of youth, she turned and ran back toward her birthday cake, leaving the heavy past behind her. The final time Damien saw Elena in person was at a charity event nearly 7 years after their divorce. He had returned to New York quietly, looking much thinner, less polished, still wealthy but no longer a man who inspired fear. Elena stood across the room speaking with donors for the Vance Initiative. Justin was beside her, but he was not hovering, and he was not trying to own the space around her. Aria held Elena's hand for a moment before running off to play with Chloe. Damien did not dare approach them. Elena eventually saw him, and their eyes met across the crowded room. There was absolutely no hatred in hers. That was the final, stinging humiliation for him. He realized with sudden clarity that he was no longer important enough to hate. Damien Blackwood always thought betrayal was something he could manage with a checkbook. He truly believed a wife's silence was the same thing as total surrender. He assumed a pregnant woman would be far too afraid, too emotional, and too dependent to ever fight back against him. Elena proved him wrong in the most devastating way possible. She did not just expose his pathetic affair. She exposed the entire structural system that allowed him to believe people were merely his possessions. She took her name back. She protected her daughter. She turned a marriage built on manipulation and control into the solid foundation of her new freedom. That was not just revenge. That was justice, finally finding a heartbeat.